Today we're going to talk about writing the equations given the graph. And so I'm going to start with number 1 here. And so we're going to start with the amplitude. But the first thing we want to do when we're doing this is we want to identify where the midline, the maximum, and the minimum is. So we're going to start by identifying where the maximum is right here. The minimum right here. And then the midline is in between those two, so in between -5 and 5 is 0. And so now we're going to want to find our amplitude, and our amplitude is the distance from the midline to the maximum. And so that distance is 5. Next we want to find our period, so we want to try to find first, do we have a point on the y-axis that's at our minimum, our midline, or our maximum, and we have one on our midline, so that's where we'll start. And so we're going to follow along. We need to hit a maximum and a minimum and then finish where we started. And so that took us from 0 to pi over here, and so that's a distance of pi, so our period is pi. And now the phase shift is where our starting x value is. So our starting x value here is at x equals 0, so our phase shift is 0. Our vertical shift is our midline. Well, our midline is at y equals 0, so our vertical shift is 0. And now we want to write our function, so we're going to have y equals our a value. And so since we're hitting a maximum up here first, it's going to be a positive a value, and then it's just the amplitude after that. And then this makes an S shape, or starts at the midline, so it's going to be a sine graph. We need to find our b value. To find our b value, we're going to use our period. Our b value is equal to 2 pi divided by our period. And so in this case, that's 2 pi divided by pi, which gives you 2. And so it's going to be 2, and then times x. And then we have no phase shift or vertical shift, so that's it. A couple things to note is that with our phase shift, we want to avoid a phase shift if possible. And then the other thing that we want to note about our phase shift is that it's going to be our starting x value. And then we're going to make a note about our vertical shift, and our vertical shift is our midline. And then we'll move on to the next question. So number 2 over here, we're going to start by identifying our maximums and our minimums. So we have a max here at 3. We have a minimum here at -1. This distance is 4, and so we want to be in the middle of that. So that means that we're going to go 2 and 2. So now we're going to find our amplitude, which is the distance from our midline to our maximum. And so that distance is 2. Now we want to find our period. So looking at the y-axis, we're going to look for a point on our minimum, midline, or maximum. And we have a point on our maximum. So that's going to go all the way around until we hit a minimum and go back. And that took us from 0 to 2 pi, and so our period here is 2 pi. Our starting x value here is at x equals 0, so our phase shift is 0. And then our midline is up at y equals 1, so our vertical shift is 1. And now we write our function, so we have y equals, we had a maximum up here, and so it's going to be a positive a value, and our amplitude is 2. So that's going to be a positive 2. This is a cosine graph because it starts on the maximum or if you turn your graph sideways, it kind of looks like a C, so it starts with so it's a cosine graph. We need to find our B value, and so our B value is 2 pi divided by our period, which gives us 1. No phase shift, so it's just 1 times x, and we're done in there. And then we have a vertical shift of 1, so it's plus 1 on the end. So this one gives us our midline right here, which is helpful. And then we have our minimum, and we have our maximum. And so now we're going to find our amplitude, which is the distance from our midline to our maximum. And that's a distance of 2. And then our period, looking at the y-axis here, we want to look for a point on the minimum, midline, or maximum, and we have one on the maximum. So that's where we start. Follow along, hit a minimum, and go back to where we started. And so that took us from 0 here to 6 pi, so our period is 6 pi. Our phase shift, our starting x value right here is x equals 0, and so our phase shift is 0. Our vertical shift, our midline, is at y equals 3, so we have a vertical shift of 3. And then our function is going to be y equals, we hit a maximum up here first, so it's going to be a positive a value, and so it's 2. This starts at a maximum, or looks like a c, so it's cosine. We need to find our b value. B is equal to 2 pi divided by our period, which gives us 1/3. And so that's going to be 1/3. There's no phase shift, so it's just x and we're done. And then we have a vertical shift of +3. And then number 4, start with finding our minimum down here, and then our maximum up here. And so halfway between those is right here. So we have our maximum, our midline, and our minimum. And then just a quick note, it's not printed well. This is at positive 1/2, and this is at negative 1/2 down here. So now let's find our amplitude. So from the midline to the maximum is our amplitude, and so that's an amplitude of 1/2. And then we want to do our period. So looking at the y-axis, we want to look for a point on the minimum, midline, or maximum, and we have one on the midline right here. So then we follow our graph, hit a minimum, a maximum, and then back to where we started. So that took us from 0 right here to 2 pi over 5 right there. So our period is 2 pi over 5. And then our phase shift, our starting x value here is at x equals 0, so our phase shift is 0. And then our vertical shift, our midline is at y equals 0, so we have a vertical shift of 0 as well. Now we write our function, so y equals, we hit a minimum here before we hit a maximum, so we're actually going to have a negative a value, so it's going to be negative 1/2. This creates an s, or starts at the midline, so it's sine, and then of, we don't have a phase, we need to find our b value. So our b value here, we're going to say it's 2 pi divided by our period. So we have to rewrite that as 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal. And so the 2 pi's cancel, and we end up just getting b equals 5 right there. There's no phase shift, so it's just 5 times x, and we're done. And there's no vertical shift, so we don't have to add anything to the end. Now if we keep going, we have right here our amplitude, if you remember from last time, is the absolute value of our a value. And so this is our a value, so it's the absolute value of negative 10 or 10. And then our period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. This is really a 1x over 6, so our b value here is 1 over 6. So we're going to do 2 pi over 1 divided by 1 over 6, or 2 pi over 1 times 6 over 1, which gives us 12 pi as our answer. Our phase shift is if there's anything added or subtracted inside of our parentheses right here, and there's not, so we have no phase shift. And then our vertical shift is whether or not we add or subtract something on the end, which we don't, so there's a 0 for our vertical shift as well. All right, so we actually want to think of this 5 here as being on the end, so plus 5 there instead. And so now let's start our amplitude. This is our A value, so it's the absolute value of -2 or 2. Our period, our B value is 2/3, so our period is 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal of that. The 2's will cancel, so that ends up giving us 3 pi. Our phase shift is if we add or subtract anything in the parentheses here, which we do not, so it's 0. And then our vertical shift is what's being added or subtracted to the end, so it's 5. So amplitude, absolute value of this A value, so absolute value of 3 is 3. Our period, our B value here is 6, so our period is 2 pi divided by that B value of 6, or pi over 3. Our phase shift, we want to take what's in our parentheses here, and we want to set it equal to 0, and solve for x. So subtract pi from each side. So we get 6x equals -pi. And then divide each side by 6, and so you would end up getting x is -pi over 6, so your phase shift is -pi over 6. And then your vertical shift is if there's anything added or subtracting on the end, so we don't have anything right there, so it's 0. Alright, so we have our A value, so the absolute value of that. Our B value is 2/3 here, which is the same as number 6 above. So you can follow that same process right there. So you'd get a period of 3 pi. Your phase shift, take what's in the parentheses and set it equal to 0. So 2/3 x minus pi over 3 equals 0. Add your pi over 3 to each side. So you have 2/3 x equals pi over 3. We want to multiply by the reciprocal on each side. These 3's will reduce. And so you're going to get x equals pi over 2. So our phase shift is pi over 2. And then our vertical shift is whether or not we have anything adding on the end, and we do not, so it's 0. So now down here, we have our amplitude. So if we want to write this function, it's going to be y equals, we're using a sine function, so we're going to have our amplitude of 1/2, and then sine of, there's no phase shift, so we can just do our parentheses. And we need to find that b value, so b equals 2 pi over 1 times the reciprocal. The pi's cancel, so you end up getting 6 times x, no phase shift, so we close, and then a vertical shift of -4. So here we have y equals, and then we have an amplitude of 7. We're using a sine function. We have a phase shift here, so we're actually going to use brackets. And then we still need to find that b value. So b is equal to 2 pi over 1. Oh, I'm using the wrong thing, sorry. So we're using the period here. So b is equal to 2 pi divided by that period, and so that gives us 1/2. And then we're going to do parentheses, and we're going to have our x, and then we're going to do the opposite of for our phase shift, so the opposite of this, so we're actually going to do plus pi over 3. And there's no vertical shift, so there's nothing added or subtracted to the end. All right, so here we have y equals, we have an amplitude of 1. We're using a cosine function. We have a phase shift, so we're going to do bracket. We need to find that b value. So b equals 2 pi divided by our period. So that gives us 1. And then parentheses, x. Our phase shift is the opposite of this. So since it's positive 5 pi over 6, we're going to subtract 5 pi over 6. Close parentheses, close bracket. And then we have a vertical shift of 3, so we need to add 3 on the end. And then lastly, we have y equals an amplitude of 3, cosine function. We have a phase shift, so we want to use a bracket. Find our b value. And then parentheses with an x. And then our phase shift's opposite, so it's negative pi, so we want to add pi. Close parentheses, close bracket. And then our vertical shift is negative 1.5.